everyone. Welcome to our talk. It's called Contextualizing Research, a Method. My name's Katey. I'm a UX designer here on the Battlefield franchise, and I work in the production team.
And I'm Tommy Olssen, and I'm an associate UX researcher specializing in game accessibility here at DICE.
So with me in production and Tommy in research, we hope that together our combined perspectives and points of view will help us present this talk in a way that can resonate with the majority of you in the audience today. So where did we begin? And what are the topics are that we're covering today? Well, we're going to talk about where we began and the challenges that we're facing, the method that we came up with, and our learning and findings that we've had from that method in what we hope will help inspire you on where to begin with improving accessibility. So where did we begin? We opened up a master thesis position, and this is where the lovely Tommy here came on board, and he helped us evaluate Battlefield 5, Battlefield 1, and Battlefield 4, and let us know, where does the accessibility stand on these games? How accessible are these games?
So to learn where our games stand in terms of accessibility, the first evaluation was done by using a checklist. And this checklist was filled with guidelines that was found from researching what the best practices are. That was found by reviewing academic papers, Xbox and game accessibility guidelines, and other types of community work. And the checklist was filled with shooter-relevant guidelines and other guidelines that covers elements in our games, such as menu navigation, storytelling, and player communication. And this was done by that the checklist was then used on our titles by playing through parts of each game while going through the checklist items. So for instance, if a feature was identified in game, the item was marked as check. And if it was not included, it was left unchecked. And one example of that is that we have the guideline of subtitles are provided for all speech. And if this was identified in the game, the item was marked as check. But after having used the checklist, there was a aha moment. And we came to the realization that a binary checklist was not sufficient for us to evaluate the level at which an accessibility guideline was met.
So for example, we have subtitles in Battlefield 5, but not for all spoken content in the game, as we can see in this example that we've got for you coming up.
Well done. We have taken objective able.
The voiceover says, "Well done, we have taken objective able." And there is some text on the screen, but it's quite small. I'm not sure if you would have spotted it. It was just above the big F there in the middle of the screen. It said objective A taken. This could be jarring for someone that's trying to hear what the announcer said. And by reading that text, it doesn't completely line up with what is said, which could be a jarring experience. On top of that, that text was actually very small. So if you're able to hear what he said, you're able to take advantage of that event and that communication more than someone who wouldn't be able to hear it. We also have speaker names in Battlefield 5, but again, it's not for every speaker. So here is the speaker name, great stuff. But there's no speaker name here, so it's missing. We also have some options in Battlefield 1 where the player can change a hold to toggle. But again, not in all scenarios. So this is the first single player level of the game, and the player is required to repair their vehicle by holding down a button. And you have to be able to complete this in order to progress the game. And it's quite a long hold too, so if a player is not able to hold this, then they wouldn't be able to progress, and that isn't an option in the settings. So do we check off the guideline that we've provided subtitles and that we've changed hold to toggles where appropriate in these scenarios or not?
So we felt that we needed a better tool to evaluate the full details of the accessibility status of our games. And for this, we came up with a new method, which we're sharing in case it may help you, or if you don't know where to start, or if you feel overwhelmed when trying to work on accessibility in your studio or game. And this has helped us, and we hope that it can be helpful for you too. And this method can basically be done by anyone with an interest to make accessibility improvements in their games, and we're going to break it down as much as we can. One of the things that the new method is that it's not a checklist. And rather than just checking off features from a list, the new method takes a more user-centered approach by examining the game from the user's perspective, by applying it to goal-centered scenarios of user flows of the game. And one of the benefits of this is that it contextualizes the guidelines. The more user-centered approach puts the guidelines into a familiar context, making the experience more relatable for a developer, as developers may intuitively not understand why something may be an issue, and it can be difficult to understand why features should be included, as the guidelines can be too abstract to be put into a context. So with this user-centered approach, it will be easier to follow a user experience flow to get an understanding of where and why in the game experience barriers occur, as well as that it provides an understanding on why some features are included and how these features help. And this new method allowed us to identify and document the level at which an accessibility guideline was met. And this is what we call a guideline conformity. If the guideline conformity is fully met, this means that the current feature is fully carried out in the way that's recommended by accessibility research. If it's partially met, it means that only some or part of the feature works as recommended. And if it's not met, it means that the feature does not exist at all. And we want to share how this method can be created and used so that you can learn and replicate it if that can be useful for you. So the first step to create this method is to identify all of the guidelines that are relevant to your game. And I would recommend starting off by creating a spreadsheet and fill it with the guidelines from resources such as Xbox and game accessibility guidelines. The next step is to sort the guidelines into suitable categories depending on your goal and project.
And from a production point of view, what I would recommend is that you think about how the game is broken down from a production side. Try to use categories or labels that make sense for how the game is actually broken down. That way, this document's going to be much easier to create actions from and use as a way to synchronize between you in research, or maybe you're not in research, and production team. It also maybe means that you can put things in like the feature owners already, as we see here with Jane Doe and John Smith, super important developers here.
So the next step is to identify a user scenario with a user goal in the game and write that scenario down. And these scenarios can be critical paths of the game and can, for instance, be shorter scenarios from that player wants to adjust the volume settings to longer scenarios as player wants to play the first single player level of the game. In step 4, in this either identified user scenario, identify and list all of the tasks or things that the users can do and need to be aware of in order to play the game, from the start state to a goal state of the user flow, and all of the tasks that happens in between. The start state can, for instance, be the home screen of the game, and the end screen can be the end round screen of the game. And the things that can be done in between are tasks such as navigating the menus, reading the text, and playing the game mode. To give an example of that, here is one of the scenarios that I used for Battlefield 5, where a player wants to play the multiplayer mode Conquest, which is one of Battlefield's signature modes. And here we have the start state of the home screen to the goal state of the end of round screen. And some of the tasks that are done are in between there are adjusting the settings, viewing HP, moving around, and aiming and shooting. And it looked something like this in the spreadsheet. So on the left, you have the scenario of a player wants to play Conquest, where a sample of the tasks are listed. So you can see, for instance, the home screen and navigating through the menus with the steps there. And on the right is a shorter scenario of player wants to lower the master volume and the included tasks for that scenario. And this leads us to step 5. And this is where the evaluation can be initiated. And this is done by comparing the tasks to the relevant guidelines of that task. So the evaluator should document the guideline conformity, so to document when the conformity is fully met and where it's not met. And in those cases, the evaluator should take notes of where in the flow and in which of the tasks this happens. So to show how this works, here we have the scenario of that we have the guideline of player is not required to hold down inputs that we compare to relevant tasks. So one of the tasks is main menu navigation. And in this task, there are no button holding requirements. So in this case, this is checked off. For zoom, aim, and shoot, the player needs to hold down a button in order to zoom. But the game includes a toggle alternative for that action. So this can be checked off. And then we have chat wheel communication. And this is an action that requires button holding to show the chat wheel without any toggle alternatives. So this is not marked as check. And as holding down a button continuously while performing an action is difficult or not possible for some players, this means that they will not be able to use the chat wheel, which is an important feature for Battlefield. So this means that the guideline conformity is partially met, as we have some button holding actions with toggle alternatives, but we don't have this for all actions. And this is then documented in the spreadsheet in which of the tasks this becomes an issue. So here we have the guideline of players not required to hold down inputs, and we have marked the task of where this becomes an issue, so for chat wheel communication.
The next step is for you to document these findings. It's really good for the production team to observe that, okay, we fully met this guideline. Well, now we need to know that we need to preserve these features. In this example on the right, you as a player are able to remap all of your key bindings in Battlefield 5, which when was perhaps originally initiated in the game, it wasn't possibly done from an accessibility point of view immediately. In a way, it may have been accidental accessibility from the developer's perspective. So we need to help them understand which things that they've already done that are actually pro-accessibility. In the same respect, we of course need to understand what's required to go from a partially met conformity to fully meeting the recommended guidelines. In one of our cases, it's about consistently applying the guideline. So with the speaker name on the subtitles here, we just need to make sure it's consistently applied, and then we'll fully meet that recommendation. In another scenario, it would be about tweaking the subtitles. The subtitles in Battlefield 5 are there, and that's awesome, but you can't necessarily customize them with a colored background and the size to increase them. Those two options don't necessarily enable us to be fully meeting the recommendations from accessibility research. So that just needs a bit of tweaking. And then of course we need to document when there are things where we're not meeting at all. In this small example on the right, we can see that we have voice chat within the squad, but we don't have speech to text. So if you're not quite able to hear what these people are saying, you wouldn't know what they're saying. And that requires a new feature, possibly some innovation and creativity as well. So this is the kind of flowchart that you're going to go through as you document those findings. You're asking yourself, has this feature been carried out according to the guidelines? Yes, fully. Okay, let's make sure we preserve that. And that needs to be noted. We don't want to lose any awesome accessibility that we've created. No? Okay, what's the exact requirement then to meet it? And in our case, it's often been these three kinds of labels. We either needed to consistently apply the guideline, we either needed to tweak the feature just to get it up to the quality standard just a little bit more, or we actually sometimes need completely new solutions.
And to validate if the identified unmet needs that were identified by using this method are actually aligned with player experiences, we have conducted user studies and plan to do more. And what we can see from analyzing the findings is that this is not a method that covers everything, and not all barriers will be taken into consideration. But essentially, the method is great to identify the minimum basics that the game should be covering. But beyond that, there is more research and analysis to be done.
Then we can talk a little bit about how the findings can be utilized. So you have all these amazing research findings. Now you can use them to raise awareness of how current solutions fare up with developers. You can talk about very specific scenarios of where a feature meets or doesn't meet a guideline recommendation and why that's a problem, which leads into it being very contextual and frames that barrier very empathetically to the rest of the developers. I think we're at a position now where us in production, we have empathy and want to have better accessibility, but we need help discovering how and where that can be improved. And then naturally that identifies the ownership, the stakeholders, as they all start coming out of the woodwork when we start talking about these actions. These kind of findings led us into a workshop. So we get people together from all kinds of teams and crafts in production and research, and together we're looking at how can we improve accessibility in the game. A lot of the findings were listed, the scenarios of where we have existing features, the scenarios of where we have unmet needs, all broken down into different categories and sections on boards in that we actually use Miro for this one. And from there, we were able to assign different groups to the different categories, and they were able to go into little breakout rooms and discuss about, well, what are the ideas here? Can we come up with different ideas of how to improve this? Which then led to this, then taking those ideas and kind of categorizing them into things that we need to keep, things we need to improve, and things we need to create. And because we had such different people in the team in this workshop, we were able to talk about this from design point of view, technical point of view, and that just really had a great basis for discussions to go there from. Which leads us to the important discussions, which is something that in the game industry now is going to be the big thing that's going to move us forward in accessibility, because when we talk about all these things that we want to improve, difficult topics come up. For us, we noticed that we were discussing things like, how do we determine what important game sounds are in our games? Battlefield games are very chaotic. It's kind of hard to predict what is the sounds that are the most important that we need to provide a visual representation for. And our HUD in Battlefield is very busy, so it can be quite difficult to figure out how to drive the player attention and what is the most important thing going on at that time for the player. Another discussion that we found ourselves having is, well, subtitles for everything could be really overwhelming. Would it actually be a good experience to subtitle everything in a Battlefield game? When you're playing a multiplayer game like Battlefield 5, there are soldiers shouting around you all the time. It's quite a chaotic experience. How do we determine what should have priority? What should the subtitle settings actually be then for a Battlefield game? And how will a player understand those options in the option menu to then cater their subtitles to their needs that they will know will be a good fit for them?
So going back to the research method, just to summarize how the steps again on how you should proceed on if you want to try this research method by yourself, is to first list all of the relevant guidelines that are relevant to your game, categorize these guidelines into suitable categories, establish a user scenario, a critical path of the game that you want to investigate, and list the tasks within this user scenario. And then you can start your evaluation and document the findings. And to conclude is that this method can be used to compare the features and designs of your game to accessibility recommendations. The work puts the guidelines into a format that the production can understand, and it can be used by big and small teams.
That's it for our talk today. So thank you so much for listening. And if you have insights or feedback on how you've improved accessibility in your studio or game, we'd love to hear from you. We feel like we're all in this journey together to improve game accessibility.
Thank you. Bye.